That's Marcel.
Okay, that's great.
If you have to introduce him, go Alt Tab Tab. Whoops, sorry.
To
Alt Tab to that one. We're up. We're back. Yeah, just Alt Tab, and we're to Marcel's.
Alt tab to get to Marcel's. Okay.
And I'm here to help.
Yeah, because I will speed this up.
You think we should get started?
For a minute or two early. Yeah. It's a great shot. Guys, well, you weren't out.
No. This room has 104 chairs, and we're going to fill every single one.
It's fantastic. You should. Yep. Yeah, that's great.
Everybody, if we can get started here. There are still some empty seats in the middle of the room. I don't think we're going to have enough seats for everybody. A testament to who we're honoring today. So, welcome everybody. I'm Todd Cervel. I'm the department head in the Department of Anthropology. That was a position first held by George Frison in 1967. I'm sure we'll hear many remarkable things about George today. One remarkable thing about him becoming department head was that he graduated with his bachelor's degree in 1964, and 3 years later was the department head of the department that granted him that degree. Actually, that's not true. The department didn't exist when he was granted his bachelor's degree. We lost George a little over a year ago. And because of this pandemic, we haven't had an opportunity to reflect on that, and that's what this event is all about. I think those of us who knew him would agree that he would probably not like us making a big fuss over him. But we're here to honor him. We're here for him. We're also here for each other to share memories and to memorialize what, by any measure, was a remarkable life. Whether we talk about George as an archaeologist or a rancher or a veteran or a husband or a father. And we have a number of speakers today who are going to speak to their personal remembrances of George and various aspects of George's life and career. This event is being live streamed by the university on YouTube, and I welcome our online audience. I'm not going to say anything else except I'm going to introduce you to the other person who's helped us organize this event, Dr. Jason Toohey, who's the director of the Frison Institute.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Todd. And I'd like to follow Todd by welcoming everybody who's here. It's a great turnout. It's a fantastic turnout. and everybody else online. Thank you for being here today. As Todd said, I'm the current director of the Frison Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, and I have the honor every year of working with my board to fundraise, but more importantly, to be able to give money out. And going forward, giving money through the Frison board is going to be all about doing the work that Doc would have loved and that Doc loved, supporting good archaeology, field work, and graduate students, as well as undergrads and seniors. So I'm not going to talk about myself anymore, but I want to introduce Dr. Marcel Cornfield, who's going to get us kicked off with some reminiscences, I think, about Doc. Thank you. All set.
I'm glad you think it's reminiscences about Doc rather than George Frison in the Department of Anthropology, because it is reminiscences about Doc, more than Department of Anthropology. But there is the mixture of the two. I figured there would be people here that knew George more or less or otherwise, and we should include that. Now, how do I set this thing on timer? Because if I don't have it on timer, never mind.
I have no idea. I think it's going.
Somebody's
It's going automatically.
Oh, it's going automatically. Okay, good. Thank you.
So you don't have to push anything.
Yeah, but now I got to go back because I don't know where the hell I am. Okay, so first of all, I'm drinking Johnny Walker Black in honor of George. Cheers to George, everybody. As I said, I kind of struggled what I was going to talk about, Department of Anthropology or George Moore, and decided to talk about George Moore and then include the department here and there. Also, the next two speakers are going to, or several speakers will have more to say about George and the department as well. We all know, and we've said it over again, George was born in Warland, Wyoming, 3 months after his father died in a hunting accident, and he was raised by his grandparents. Through the 1930s, as Frison was growing up, he grew to be interested in prehistory. He visited dinosaur digs. Barnum Brown was excavating in the area. He might have, for all I know, been at the Howe Quarry down there with Barnum. What did I miss on that slide? Nothing. Nah, I got to go back. I'm sorry. In 1942, he decided to go to the university. He was encouraged by his grandparents to get an education, which he was interested in. And he took courses in sociology, and either informally or formally, he either took courses or by Marshall Jones, who was a sociologist, probably department head at the time. He only spent a semester there, then in 1943 enlisted in the Navy, and after the Navy visited Japan and China after the Navy, after the war. And during that time that he was there, Marshall Jones taught what we think is a first course in anthropology, social anthropology. George returned from the Navy with a Japanese rifle, 6.5 millimeter Arisaka 99 that had been issued to the Japanese Navy, as soldiers would always come back with souvenirs of various kinds. That one supplied him with meat and was his main hunting rifle, and I think we may hear more about that hunting rifle today. We're going to hear more about it? No? Anyway, George went June Glanville in 1946. 2 years later, William Malloy was the first anthropologist hired at the Anthro department. And although I don't think this is a place to contradict each other, I did a lot of research. George got his degree in 1964, a Bachelor of Science. Turns out the 1964 bulletin has anthropology in it. He might have been the first graduate student in anthropology. In 1963, anthropology was part of sociology, economics, geography, and something else. In any case, 1951, after returning from the war, Frison got further interested in archaeology, or maintained an interest, and went to visit Princeton excavations at the Horner site, where he met the then geologist Robert Witter and his son Dan, who was later his colleague at the university. He started his teaching before teaching, actually, as in here, demonstrating sheep castration on the ranch to the ranch hands in the absence of knives. In 1962, the year that he returned from the ranch, oh, I'm not supposed to move away from here. Oh, shoot. Frison completed his degree at the UW between 62 and 64, as I said, first in sociology and then anthropology, on a hunting trip with his mother-in-law, Carolyn Glanville, daughter Carol, and I believe George Siemens, although I'm not quite sure about that. The four-field approach that Malloy had instituted rubbed off on Frison, and his colleagues at Michigan were linguist, a physical anthropologist, and a cultural anthropologist. The cultural anthropologist was a Marshall fellow. Gee, this is going too fast. What else? Oh, no, good. As Todd had indicated, Frison graduated in 67. Malloy apparently had a job for him as a department head. And so from 67 to 78, Frison worked on building the Department of Anthropology with the introduction of the MA program in 69. Yeah, okay. Anthropology at that time was in the A&S building, and I don't mean in the A&S building. We didn't have the building. It was one floor and a little bit up and down, including the basement where all the bones were stored. OSA, Office Wyoming State Archaeologist, storage facilities, other things, everything was there. There were some things in the rat house. Frison strives to build a four-field department. He managed to get a linguist from another department at A&S. That was Ann Slater. The result by late 1970s was 6 faculty members, 2 cultural anthropologists, 2 archaeologists, 1 physical, and 1 linguist. And Frison instituted at about that time what I guess one would call an egalitarian faculty salary increases, if there was any to be had, with which we're all familiar, who were the faculty types here. In 78, the department moves to a new space in the old law building because the growing department needed space, and there was storage in the Cooper Mansion. However, space continues to be a problem, and both Office of Wyoming State Archaeologists and State Historic Preservation Office have to move off. Frison also demonstrated lots of things outside of the classroom, such as setting dynamite charges in a big boulder in order to remove it from the Medicine Lodge Creek site when that became necessary. His early research involved things like what one of his professors named the Frison effect, or not supposed to move away from here, or the resharpening of tools and how that changes their typological qualities. Certainly George was not above jousting with friends, and here with Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley, both of whom he worked with for a long time subsequently. After discovery of an 8,500-year-old sheep hunting net near Cody, Wyoming, Frison wanted to learn more about sheep behavior, so he went to watch fish and game folks net sheep for tagging them and so on and so forth, and he found out that, gee, sheep become really docile when you throw a net over them. Maybe that has something to do with hunting techniques. He also went hunting himself. Probably close to the top pinnacle of his career, around mid-1980s, he spent a lot of time with the Society for American Archaeology and other archaeologists, and this was at a meeting in Slidell Louisiana that had something to do with discussing future of archaeology. For those of you that know George, perhaps you can enjoy the toothpick and the King Rose hat. Other experiments that he was greatly involved with was with elephants. And after excavating the Colby site, he had lots of questions about how elephants might have been hunted. And George also always loved Larson cartoons. I don't know if you can see that. Too late. These kinds of experiments also carried him to Africa, where he could experiment on elephants after the culls were made, both on seeing the penetration of projectile points and skinning of elephants. Now, for an old Navy man, what do you do in Wyoming? Well, you take your backhoe in the middle of the Snake River and try to make a wake. Other things that George did during about those days, 1989, as a matter of fact, here is as a rapprochement ambassador and opening the Soviet front with other distinguished colleagues. Olga Sofer, who was the organizer along with George of this thing, always told me that, the fella to the left of George there is Louis Binford, that having Binford and George was the best thing she ever made a decision on. Lou Binford, having grown up in Virginia in the 1930s, sang mining labor songs, and George talked to the Soviet farmers about cows. Great team. Some of the milestones that went on from the 80s and 90s included, from 83 on, George received numerous awards from professional societies, vocational societies, University of Wyoming, State of Wyoming, and others. In 87, he stepped down as a department head. Stop it. 95, he retired. 97, he was inducted in the National Academy of Sciences, not probably, the pinnacle of his ambitions, I think. And as far as I know, he's still the only UW member in the National Academy. Mid-1980s, Ag Arena was secured for the anthropology, which partially reunited anthropology, but it left us on two opposite ends of the campus. State Historic Preservation Office returned. There was space for University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository, but Zooarchaeology Laboratory ended up being away from the rest of the faculty. In 1998, Frison Institute was approved by Board of Trustees, and in 2002, Anthropology initiates a PhD program. Anthropology reunited, 2007. Our new building was built in 2007. Department of Anthropology, Zooarchaeology Laboratory, Office of Wyoming State Archaeologist, State Historic Preservation Office, University, what did I say? Well, I'm not there yet. Archaeological Repository and Frison Institute. And the first PhD was granted in anthropology. Now, if George was here, probably somewhere towards the end of his talk, he would start ranting and raving about the new reorganization of the university. I think this picture says it all. I wouldn't go any further. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll have remarks by Dr. Charles Rare, who was not only one of the department's first MA graduates, but Doc hired Chuck in a faculty position in which he served for a very long time. So, Chuck. To advance. I think you can hit this. The right arrow will work. arrow's forward, left arrow's back. Okay.
Whoa, look at this. First, I would have to say, especially like given Dr. Cornfield's just talk and everything going on here today, that what I have to say is just going to be some real basic sort of comments. I was kind of embarrassed by that, you know, but I was just going to talk a bit about things and show a few sites where I found pictures of Frison that I had. And so a few comments like that, please bear with me. Whenever you talk about George, it is kind of like I found is, well, where to start? So much. Where to stop? How do you stop? It just goes on and on. There's so much you can say. It's incredible what he did. You know, his founding department head and teaching classes and publications, like so many publications, books and articles, excavations all summer. The state archaeologist founding, how could he do all that? And all the while being so pleasant, so nice, just generally a nice person. I grew up in the small town of Pine Bluffs, Wyoming, down in the corner there. And back then there was no interstate. And I was 2 houses away from just walking up in the bluffs. And there's stuff all over up there. The foothills outlier, the ecology's just right. So it attracted people, and then you could hunt bison all the way around it. But down there in Pine Bluffs, from Pine Bluffs on down in Colorado, about 20 miles, there's well over 1,000 teepee rings. There's fire-cracked rock everywhere, and when I grew up, I just would pick up flakes and pick up, not so many flakes, but tools and so forth, and put them in coffee cans. They'd fill up. So that's kind of how I grew up there, and I remember when I found my first arrowhead. Bear with me, I was talking about me too much. I found my first arrowhead, and I went back to one of my grandfathers, Ole Culligan, who had a little filling station and a motel outside of Pine Bluffs, but he also was a gunsmith, and he had this a trailer out beside where he repaired guns, and in his filling station was frame after frame after frame of one of the best gun collections in North America. It later was taken over by the family after he passed away and went for tens of thousands of dollars. And he specialized in just the best quality and the lowest serial number, and so I grew up thinking it was all right to like collect stuff and put it in like frames and so forth. I'm just carrying on here, but I remember bringing in my first arrowhead, and I said, "Is this what I think it is? Is it a low-eyed arrowhead?" He was working in a shop. He says, "Yes." I said, "But the little point's broken off." So he said, "Here, I'll show you something." And he got back under his workbench and came out with antler tine, and he put a point back on it. So I thought, cool, I didn't know you could do that. And, much more I could say, but that's kind of how I got my start. So when I got to college, everybody, go into engineering, my lad, because there you will get a job and so forth. So I went into engineering, and it was okay, but it just wasn't, after Pine Bluffs, it wasn't getting outside, it wasn't outdoors. So took a class with Bill Malloy, and then went in at one point and talked to Dr. Frison, got an appointment, and I said, if I change it to a major in anthropology, what do you do about this? What about jobs? How do you get jobs? I got a family to support. And he goes, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you a job now in the lab, measuring end scrapers. Come with me." So we walked down the old A&S building, and I remember thinking, what do you measure end scrapers for? Don't you just put them in coffee cans? Reminiscence. Yeah, so after that, I worked for George every year and all year. There he was, excavations all around Wyoming. And I remember working beside him and learning about pedestals and proveniences and carefully excavating and watching him to learn how to do it. That was how I got my start, and I quickly was promoted to be a crew chief. And so now when you go to like his book, Rancher Archaeologist and other things, and you see like pictures of the Glen Rock, big excavations and deep ones and bone beds, and I think I took those pictures and I dug at those units because he would put me in charge. I must carry on here, and then he would leave and go, research other sites and find paleo sites and go out and stuff, and come back after a while. So that's kind of how I got my start. And he was so incredible how he could work with landowners. There's something about him they just sensed, I think, spoke the same language, and he could get permission everywhere and so forth. But now I start this. Yeah, there's just an old picture I found of him excavating at a site and so on. And the Wyoming chronology that we use, he did that. That's how we know all of those. And of course, his favorites were Paleo Indian points, the Colby site by Worland, and you see a few scenes of that. But again, went forward here. Oh, I think it skipped one. Yeah, it skipped one for some reason. But that's the kind of excavations he could do, and you'd watch him do it. It's incredible. Colby Mammoth site, now a nice display in our Anthropology Museum. If you haven't been there, you're required to go. And, oh, dang it, I got a bunch of extra ones it's not showing. Well, if I look through the collection and got some slides of George working away, here's the kind of thing you would see. The Colby Mammoth site, Bruce Bradley there. And how did they do that? Well, of course, there's different episodes, different versions of how you do a mammoth in, but he would know that it was with the spears and so forth, and would experiment. As Marcel just stated in his incredible talk, boy, you can't pass up an opportunity if you're George, like a dead circus elephant hanging upside down. So we watched him do things like that. Yeah. Go to the Glen Rock Buffalo Jump, incredible site where they ran the bison over the edge, and that's one of his favorite site types, of course. How to kill bison, and Glen Rock Buffalo site with that sort of application, and then on into where he worked with late prehistoric and early late prehistoric and atlatl points. All of this you learned from George, working with him. Corner-notched corner-notched dart points, stemmed and lanceolate. Just some slides I had. Arrow points, the side-notched arrow points. Incredible stuff and artistic that he did. And learning all the while about the tribes, following their migrations. He was really good on that. As part of the encouragement that I got from him, I ended up being the tribal archaeologist. For 20 years, I worked up there for the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes and worked with the elders and so forth. And there's so much I learned from them. Welcome to the Frison chronology. Glen Rock site. Yeah, there's him at the kind of a poor slide, but that's him excavating away at the site and getting this lined out and stuff. And then a site that would look like this, like I mentioned, I took those pictures, but I worked with George on that sort of thing and thought that's what you do, that's how you do it. He got me so inspired to be in archaeology, learned so much. The Medicine Lodge Creek site, picture of him, that giant rock shelter, sort of really in a rock art site, one of the most incredible rock art sites in the world. And there he is, working down through 10,000 years of chronology, getting down into that site in front of that cliff. It's incredible. Yeah, also structures and features and so forth in there. Yeah, this is the kind of site, working with George, that you thought was, this is what you want to be doing. No question about it. Different kinds of features, and you see where the one level was all of the fire-cracked rock that went across the whole upper level above that, and yeah, it just slides. A hint of, we've done studies of that. I've worked up there a lot on my own, but we've done studies of that 600 or so rock images all along that cliff. Incredible sight. It's one he knew about and worked. He grew up in tent sleep, and all around him was, of course, rock shelters and artifacts and so forth. It was a rock art site. The Wardell Buffalo Trap over in the Green River Basin, and murals that museums over there have put together showing how they would run those bison into a corral and trap them, and worked a lot of bison pounds with George. Picture of him there. I would see him at sites too. He'd come in and get us going, and he'd talk and he'd look and he'd point, and we'd do provenience discussions and so on and so forth. And every once in a while, like here at Wardell, he would kind of be off there, and instead of talking, you'd see him just looking quietly at the landscape. He would just stand there and look, looking down at the river that was a half-mile away. And you could tell he was just contemplating what it would have looked like when they were there, how they did it. Behind him is a trap with all of the bison and noise and, and everything, but out there was where they came from. How did they get those bison up out of the river valley into that little canyon there? And, yeah, you just see him standing there at these different sites, contemplating. It's the way he was, the way he was. Yeah. Wardell site. And working for him and working as his crew chief and so forth, I had years of young people, interested, young, active people, students who were interested in the field school and so forth and so on. And so many stories I could tell, shut down here with George talk, but so many stories I could tell because of George. I could go on to him, but like here at the Wardell site, he would work with the landowners to let us stay in a kind of an old log cabin ranch house that had different rooms in it, and it was they were in a big new a double trailer beside that. It's what they lived in, but they had this old kind of abandoned ranch house. But we got to stay in there just on army cots. We had a kitchen and a bathroom, and it was nice. So that's what he did. He could work with landowners and always try to set us up with something like that. And the stories you could tell. I remember one time we were all sleeping at the Wardell site, and this giant thunderstorm came up, pounding, and you could tell, oh my gosh, those lightning strikes are getting louder, and they're striking all around us. And the crew would all wake up and be looking, of course, and I looked, and suddenly I saw a kind of a bright glare, like something was on fire, and I said, oh my gosh, they've started something out in the ranch there. I got to go look. And I went out to the door of the cabin, and I'm looking out there, and I think, oh shit, it's behind me. Pardon my French. And I turned around, and there was this big flame coming up the wall behind the old gas stoves. And I said, you help me with these dishes here full of water. You two, go get those buckets and go fill them at the cow tank. You run over there and wake up the landowners. We got something on fire here. So, yeah, she ran over there and pounded on their door and nobody'd answer, so she ran around and pounded on their bedroom window and broke it all over him. That woke him up. I turned around just in time to see the two students with the buckets of water come smashing into each other at the door and spill them. So I could go on. And finally we got the owners over there and we saw, and there was this flame coming up. By then the flame was going across the ceiling from behind the thing, and couldn't figure it out, but we got it out, cut it, poured out, and the owners were coming over, and then the ranch hand, and started up again. Oh, what the heck? Well, found out that what it had done is the lightning had hit the cabin and come in down through all the pipes and all the electrical cords and messed things up. But it also, up on the wall up there, it blew off the wall an old Kit Kat clock. They would sit there and the tail would wag and everything. It looked like this. And in doing that, it blew it up and turned it into a lump of slag about the size of my fist and blew it across the room and smashed it into a cabinet and stayed there. Meanwhile, the cord melted off, fell down right next to the hole in the pipe behind the gas stove. And it was flaming that. So we finally got that figured out and tried to get it off, and it kept doing it. And finally they had to run out and turn off the gas, and then they had to get the owner out there to do stuff, and we got it done. But it melted a hole in the old gas pipe, and that cord fell right down on it, just right. So I always think of the Kit Kat clock stories. But anyway, the stories we could tell. But given all that, for that, thank you, George. Just gave me my whole life in this career. Thank you, George.
Hey, thank you, Chuck. I'd like to invite former Wyoming state archaeologist Dr. Mark Miller up. And where am I going here?
I don't have any slides.
Yeah, right back there, yeah. Thank you.
I can talk in front of the cat.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. I can't ad-lib as well as Chuck, so I wrote mine down. George Frison's triumph as Wyoming state archaeologist was predictable. His robust personality traits virtually ensured it, as did a depth of character initially shaped by challenges in childhood he faced without either parent. He first saw the American West from horseback, alongside his grandfather, before caring for the old man after a debilitating riding accident. Combined with combat service on USS Navarro during World War II, these obstacles forged a powerful self-reliance and a compassionate stoicism that lasted his entire life. His career began with collaborations, first with his marriage of nearly 65 years to his lovely wife, June, who brought her own assorted talents to the partnership. They became Wyoming archaeology's twofer, parental surrogates for scores of young wet-behind-the-ears undergraduates. The second collaboration established the State Archaeologist Program. Right after it created leadership in our department. Bill Malloy drafted the relevant statute and sent it to Frison for review, who was a doctoral student at the time. Frison suggested Malloy delete the clause, giving the state archaeologist permission to conduct research anywhere, anytime he pleased, even on private land. As a former landowner himself, Frison knew that access permissions must be negotiated with each owner each time. Malloy deleted the clause and the bill passed overwhelmingly into law with the capable sponsorship of Edna Kimball Wilkins, Wyoming's first female Speaker of the House. Its funding supported Frison 1/4 time for field work each summer, but the most powerful section required the state archaeologist to be a member of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wyoming. Without this mandate, Wyoming would have faced the trend in so many states where their principal archaeologist became an administrative figurehead, responsible only for historic preservation. As said earlier, Frison's ranching background contributed to his archaeological success in a state nearly half privately owned. He spoke the language of those who lived and worked in the country. He knew cattle prices, he understood hay production, and lamented the frequent lack of moisture. Every rancher he met respected him, and no one in his circle ever forgot his unassailable integrity. Sally Forbes remembered it. She ran the Beckton Ranch in the Bighorn country and once let Frison excavate the Big Goose Creek site on her land, but she never donated the artifacts. Through the years, George periodically contacted her just to ask how her famous Red Angus cattle were doing. Then, in the last year of her life, she graciously donated the entire site assemblage after expressing gratitude for Frison's long friendship. Frison often hired the young offspring of local ranchers on whose land he was working and let them help in excavations. These invitations were his hallmark as a principal investigator, and that's how I entered the program. Once we drove to Weston County to investigate the Fulton site, a late archaic bison arroyo trap. The landowner's son wanted to help us, but his dad told him he needed to wrangle sheep for the shearer that day. Frison let me swap jobs with the boy so he could dig with our crew. Excavators came back to the ranch that evening all worn out, since they had to dig through 4 feet of sterile overburden and then ran out of daylight before they got to the bone bed. The boy was disappointed, but I had a wonderful time shearing. Frison's role as state archaeologist gave him a unique perspective for teaching, especially his course on Northwestern Plains, prehistory. The first year he taught it was 1975. One midterm question asked for a short answer to identify the term Upper Republican, a familiar prehistoric ceramic tradition found in eastern Wyoming and adjacent states. One student couldn't remember the definition, so he made up an answer. Doc chuckled when he read the response and then gave the boy half credit. The student had written, Gerald Ford, President of the United States. Frison's early investigations as state archaeologist addressed some of Wyoming's well-known historic sites. He discovered the flagpole location at Fort Phil Kearny, then found elusive structural remains at Fort Bonneville. A couple individuals in the old Wyoming Recreation Commission were historians, and since their agency was responsible for administering the state archaeologist statute, they had asked for Frison's input. However, those men expected the features to be located elsewhere on the sites and were skeptical of results derived from archaeology. Old documents carried more weight with them than did the tangible, physical evidence in the ground. This logical disconnect drove Frison away from performing much more historical archaeology, but he always supported similar efforts by his students. His own studies, combined with the subsequent work of his graduates, ultimately led one noted Wyoming historian, now deceased, to comment that the best history in the state was being done by archaeologists. Frison established a solid research program at the Medicine Lodge Creek site by 1970. You saw some slides. Doc Bonnell, the land manager, backfilled the excavation for us after field season one year, but bulldozed the enormous boulder into the deep test, causing Frison to dynamite the obstruction, and his crew to toss fractured rocks into a backhoe bucket dangling several feet above us. Then we had to excavate through a pile of used pregnancy testing gloves Bonnell had discarded after probing his young heifers. A lively sense of humor certainly helped the Wyoming state archaeologist. Other magical experiences awaited us at the Hanson Folsom site, Colby Mammoth Kill, Agate Basin, and Carter Kerr McGee, the latter locality found during a cultural resource management project. And all of these dramatically expanded Wyoming's known cultural history. Then in the early 1980s, Larry Todd, a former Frison student, brought a cohort of Lou Binford's protégés up from New Mexico to collaborate with Frison, ushering in a period of vigorous theory building. The resulting integration of empirical research with middle-range theory created the perfect balance for intellectual growth in young Wyoming archaeologists. Frison gave me permission to use the Carter Kerr McGee site for my dissertation when I left for my PhD program at the University of Colorado. He even asked me to crew chief the field project, but I turned it down to accept a slightly larger salary elsewhere on a fruitless, mind-numbing venture. So I felt obligated to withdraw my dissertation choice. Later, I read with great interest the resulting article he submitted to American Antiquity. Regrettably, the editors had him delete some comments regarding the difficulties he faced while doing basic research under a CRM framework. Some of those difficulties remain with the profession today. In 1980, Frison traveled to the Smithsonian Institution for a well-earned sabbatical leave. He phoned and asked if I would be interested in teaching a couple supply courses while he was away. Recalling my stupid decision to withdraw from the Carter Kerr McGee research, I told him I'd love the opportunity, even though I had to commute from Rawlins. Kent Flannery wrote in The Golden Marshalltown, "There exists a basic conflict between detailed, problem-oriented archaeology and adherence to archaeological ethics. The former requires you to pick a specific topic to investigate, while the latter tells you to record everything present. That duality is the main reason archaeology needs long-term collections management programs." Frison anticipated this predicament when he and Chuck collected all the bones from the Glen Rock Buffalo Jump, helping change the practice of plains archaeology forever. He began the curation program that today is the University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository, managed by the State Archaeologist's Office. Wyoming now boasts a state-of-the-art collections facility that began as Frison's small, cloistered lab in the dirt floor basement of the Arts and Sciences building. Intellectual curiosity drove George Frison. That's why he brought in anthropological scholars to interact with his students and the statewide public. Margaret Mead, Mary Leakey, and Tom Dillahay are a few notable examples. He even invited numerous professionals for on-site consultation where students gained a first-hand look at how accomplished scientists reasoned with each other about new archaeological discoveries. George's skills as state archaeologist helped him later make major international contributions to the field, especially with Soviet Union scientists during perestroika and glasnost. Collaborations with prominent Russian scholars like Olga Sofer significantly broadened the available database for Paleo-Indian studies on both sides of the pond. Frison resigned as state archaeologist in 1984 after 17 years in the position, but continued doing archaeology daily for decades as a full professor and later an emeritus professor. His profound influence across multiple subjects on multiple continents earned him the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for American Archaeology and countless other accolades mentioned today. But one of his best-known credits is even more pertinent today than when it was first recognized. Art Jelinek once defined George's work on the Piney Creek sites as archaeology's Frison effect. The term described how stone tools take on different morphologies from their initial manufacture throughout their use life and ending with their ultimate discard. It became a major contribution to developing theory on stone tool technology. In reality, the Frison effect is a far more universal concept in Wyoming archaeology. every student who ever interacted with Doc and June benefited from their grace and dignity, and thereby evolved into a more seasoned professional, having grown under their guidance as he or she passed through the developmental stages of their own youth life. George and June Frison lived archaeology because they loved it, and we love them. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. George Gill, longtime faculty member in the Department of Anthropology, one of George's longtime colleagues, one of George's first faculty hires.
Thank you, Todd. Just the best one, I guess. Appreciate all this. It's good to see all of you here. I feel a little bit different, and I should, being the non-archaeologist up here, one of the faculty and professors that knew George in a little different way. And today, so I'll be touching on some more personal kinds of things along the way, in addition to the fewer but important professional ways that we connected. I'm going to talk about my experiences with George from 4 angles about the hire, which I'm supposed to talk about, and the support I received from George right after that and for really throughout, but particularly it was important in the early years of my employment here. And then the little bit of working together that we did, because even as a biological anthropologist, there were times that we could work together in the field, and I'll explain that briefly. And then our later years, enjoyment we found with each other. I always loved Wyoming since my first visit here in junior high school in 1954. I was on a family vacation with my parents and brothers, and we drove north from Utah up to Jackson, in that fabulous part of the state that most of you have probably seen. It was summer, just green, beautiful. I couldn't believe the beauty, and then Jackson itself was more intriguing maybe than beautiful. Back in those days, Jackson, Wyoming was a small western gambling town. There was no ski resort, nothing like that. But saloons, I think it seemed to me as a kid, and about every other storefront around the square, with swinging doors on some of these, like I'd seen in the movies but never actually witnessed. And silver everywhere. Silver dollars were real then, real silver all the way through. And since practically every establishment in Jackson had a slot machine, that's what they used in the businesses. I mean, you didn't see paper dollars, not $1 bills. It was these big silver dollars. Anyway, I thought, my God, in Kansas, where I was born and grew up, we kind of lost the frontier look in the 1880s or maybe early 90s, but by God, here in Jackson, Wyoming, it's alive and well. And I appreciated that, being a fan of Western history. So as I was finishing my PhD dissertation at KU, I decided, as you might not be surprised to hear, to explore job openings in the West. And I started with Wyoming, my favorite state, and Montana State, New Mexico, and a few other Western states. Lo and behold, it was my favorite Western state, Wyoming, that had an opening. So I was invited to visit and went, and I met Malloy and Frison, and I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed my interaction with those two and enjoyed it very much. George knew that I had just started my search, so he didn't want to pressure me too much, but they were a little bit desperate. They're a physical anthropologist, because they had maintained one, and temporary ones at least, for a few years of the department's existence. And they had finally made a hire of Marianne Winton, a serologist, and she got so ill that she had to drop out, and they were reasonably sure that she would never make it back again. So he told me if I did get hired there, it would be a temporary for a year anyway. But he also knew, because I talked to him about the AAA job search was coming up, and I wanted to at least get out and look at other opportunities and kind of see what all was there, even though I had this real interest out in this part of the world. And he was so understanding of all that. So I went to the AAA. I was wine, dined, and flown around. In those days, they were desperate for physical anthropologists, as all these departments across the country were expanding, and they needed at least one person to cover the biological side of it. So I was wine, dined, and flown to University of Arkansas, Michigan State, Indiana. All these places offered me a job, and I declined the jobs and called George and accepted the one here. So in essence, I ended up taking the lowest paying job offer with the smallest skeletal collection and opportunities for research at that point. But I thought, gosh, you can build a collection, and you can do so much in a place like Wyoming with good people like Frison and Malloy. And besides, it was in the West, my favorite state, the job, and the best location of all of the offers I received for my two biggest interests outside of anthropology, riding horses and hunting big game in the wilderness areas. So I have never regretted the decision I made in my career choice. But regarding then George's welcome and support, when I arrived, driving the largest U-Haul truck they had, not that I had anything beyond just a small family, but I had a collection of skeletons from West Mexico where I'd been doing my dissertation research, and I was allowed by Kansas to take all those to Wyoming, and then eventually they went to the National Museum of Natural History in Mexico, where they exist today and are very valued and well maintained there. Anyway, so I came with that big truck with bones, our few belongings, my small family, and two Norwegian elk hounds, one of which is the ancestor of all these Wyoming mountain dogs that some of you guys in this room own. I think 5 of them are within the Department of Anthropology, a fine breed that I crafted out of my Norwegian elk hounds by crossing with a couple of other breeds, but anyway, that's another story. But what I wanted to point out with that is that as I was doing all this and coming in, unpacking, right while I was unpacking our boxes there in our rental home on Reynolds Street, George dropped in. You know, he just wanted to check and see if everything was going okay. And there were little kids screaming and dogs running around through the papers and unopened boxes and opened boxes and everything. He didn't care. He just wanted to check on Gil, his new hire, and see that everything was going all right. I soon learned that George had a real concern and interest in all of his small faculty, just like he did with me, and also with the grads and even some of the committed undergraduate students. So a real closeness existed between George and the rest of us, you know, faculty and students, and he would invite at least the graduate students and faculty periodically to his house, and we'd have drinks and converse, you know, every so often. to keep close and he could keep a tab on what we were doing and how we were doing. It was really nice, very enjoyable, and very fruitful. His daughter, Carol, became our primary babysitter for the two kids. That gives you an indication of kind of the closeness that we had and how we communicated. I was doing some real serious research and writing when I first came up here. First of all, to finish that dissertation, which hadn't been written till I got here, but after that, I wanted to knock out book chapters and articles for journals and all that, and George was very, very supportive. And he wanted to encourage anything like that, serious research. And so he went to our department secretary and made sure, talked to her and made sure she was available to type and do all the prep I needed on my articles. That was way back before computers, when nowadays faculty have to do their own stuff, most of it like that. No, it was starting when I retired. That's one reason I retired when I did. And George provided opportunities to teach in the summer if we wanted to make a little extra money, and rather than bring in someone from outside, if one of us wanted to teach the courses that they hoped to offer to students over the summer, we had first crack. And he actually even encouraged us to teach outside of our subfield, so I taught one course in archaeology and two in cultural anthropology, if you can imagine. I was way too specialized by the time most of you guys knew me to be able to do that. But in those days, right out of graduate school, and with a little reading on the side in preparation, I could do it. Working together, you guys, all of you archaeology types that have spoken so far, had opportunities, many of them, to work closely with George in the field. And I didn't, but regarding working together with him, there were two places where I was able to and did. One was excavating human burials. He had a very deep interest in the information we could gain from the skeletons. And it's true, those of you that follow that, everything from the cause of death and the age of death and all kinds of things that have a lot of importance in understanding how life was, how severe it was, the kinds of conflicts, everything. So George was right there. We formed a team then of me, the only osteologist, physical anthropologist in the department, and the state archaeologist. Because as state archaeologist, he would get the information usually coming in about a skeleton that was cut through by highway construction or some ranchers noticing an erosion and a threatened interment. So we did that together as a team until he stepped out of that position and Mark Miller stepped in, and then we became a team. And starting with Frison and me, neither one of us particularly liked a lot of intricate drafting, so we had another team member, whoever was good at that, some of our archaeology students. And Mark and I kind of continued that, and then Rick Weatherman joined us, and so I think the team concept still applies. I haven't followed it for a few years since my retirement. But the other thing was, George didn't have a special course set aside for faunal analysis, and yet that was a deep interest of his, were the bones of the animals and what he could learn. You gleaned some of that from these earlier presentations by our archaeologists. So he asked if he could just, in my human osteology class that was taught every spring, teach 2 weeks on faunal analysis, and that's what we did. So I just gave over 2 weeks of my course to slip from human bones into different key animal bones that were frequently encountered out here, and then we moved back to my subject. We also cooperated very well on issues that we did not do together, but understood each other and we could communicate on those things. One was the developing and storing of human skeletal materials. He was always right there, and we had a very good solution to handling that as we were starting what's now become the Human Remains Repository. The other thing that some would have had trouble with, but I wanted to get away at a bad time of the year in the fall to take a week and go big game hunting in wilderness areas with my horses and pack in and kill an elk and pack out and feed my family. And George fully understood. In fact, he took a week every fall too. But he said, I've got a rule though. He said, I understand, I do the same thing. He said, but I don't like the idea of a whole work week given over to something like that. We're paid, we're here to teach and do this stuff. He said, so you'll have to cover your classes if you take a work week off, basically. You got to at least teach your classes on Monday or on Friday, and then you can take the rest of that week and either the preceding weekend or the following weekend. So that's what we did. That's what he did. That's what I did. And we got through that without any complaints from the students thinking we were ditching out. But I think his solution was good, so it didn't look like, I think some people might have objected if an entire work week, they'd say, where did Gil go? Oh, he's up in the wilderness area hunting elk right now. Okay, the later years. We got to wrap this up. After teaching and doing research for about 20 years, George and I, together here at Wyoming, I began to reflect on changes with him. In other words, if you know George and if you know me, we grumbled together, he and I. We could see things some changes we didn't like. UW was more bureaucratic in those 20 years. It had greater demands on faculty, more reports, more committees. And this had resulted in less time to teach. And so the social sciences in general were moving from 3 courses a semester that we had been able to teach in the old days and still do research to 2. And he and I thought that was wrong. And instead of going and talking to administrators, we just grumbled about it to each other. Also, classes weren't, I guess we'd say that. There was more political correctness being imposed on us within our classes and kind of over our classes. And some of this came from national organizations, our own anthropology people as well as administrators. For instance, in my case, I came here, one of the courses on the book I was supposed to teach, and every department across the nation had a course entitled Human Races or Races of Mankind, or here in Wyoming, Race 669D was the course. And it was so exciting to be able to talk about the adaptive value of different population characteristics. I thought just mostly focus on that. And my gosh, the diversity we had. People were interested. I had students from Africa and blacks from all across Wyoming and Hispanics from the Southwest and some from here, and Native Americans from the Wind River Reservation and Native Americans from the Southwest, at least 2 or 3 tribes I can think of right now. And it was so exciting. But when we were more or less told we needed to change it to human variation, unfortunately, people didn't know what that was. A lot of people that would have profited by the old Race 669D. And we did expand it a little to talk about not only population differences and adaptations, but also, sex differences and differences by age and so on that occur in Homo sapiens. So it was a slightly different course. But I think the main reason that we lost all that diversity that we had before was that nobody knew what it was going to be about. And they were excited to learn about race, and they didn't know human variation didn't, sound very interesting. So anyway, George and I could grumble about those things. But one day, George and I, as we were grumbling, he said to me, here's a quote, because I remember it distinctly. He said, Gil, I don't know if we are teaching our students more or less than we were years ago, but back then, we sure as hell had more fun. And we did. The jokes weren't, censored and stuff, and all of that. They were just right out there, and everybody seemed to enjoy it. Anyway, but George and I still were able to enjoy many of our wonderful students, our research, and the smaller advanced classes where you could be a little more familiar there. So we got along fine with the rest of our careers, even with the change. After retirement, with offices on the same floor in the new building, we were able to visit rather frequently. I had a home office too. Now that's practically where I do all my work. But at that time, I was still kind of tied to campus right after I retired. And George had his nice office and lab, like I say, just down the hall. So as I'd zip in and out between my two offices and meeting with people or things, he would always just be sitting in there working away on a research topic, and he was there all the time. Boy, 8 to 5, I mean, and he said, I never really wanted a home office. It seemed I would get distracted or something. So he always was right there. So I was the one always dropping in on George, and then we could talk and grumble about the country and UW going to hell, things like that, which just got worse the older and grumpier we got. But at times we would connect at Prairie Rose Restaurant. Some of you might know that restaurant downtown. It's rather nice. Food's good, service is fast. I think George ate there more than I did, especially after June passed away. But I went there pretty often. My wife and I, Denise, we go still. And sometimes we'd see George there, and if the timing was right, we'd just invite him to come sit with us. So I had some nice discussions with George at times like that. And if Denise was with me, we had less grumbling. So that worked well. One time I was there with Richard Mahalik. Some of you probably know him from sociology, a really fun, smart, articulate guy. And he and I went there to have breakfast, and there was George up at the counter. We just asked George if he wanted to come down and join us, and he did. And we just got into the nicest conversation. Mahalik is so lighthearted about things that even if the three of us were grumbling, it didn't sound like it was coming from him. He's such a humorous and fun guy. And after we had concluded our breakfast and we're getting up, I was kind of touched in a way that George said, this was enjoyable. He said, we should do it again sometime. Because as some of you know, he didn't express these kind of things very often. And but I tried not to take too much pride in that, because I think Mahalik was the one that made it so interesting that he made that comment. And because he never had said that when just he and I were doing those things. But anyway, that's the George we all know, who didn't express a lot of things real often out loud and overtly. That's why those of you that know him know why I was a little bit surprised he said something like that after just eating breakfast together. Anyway, a marvelous guy with a lot of talent, as has been pointed out, energy, focus on his home state that he loved, on his profession he loved, and the people around him that he cared so deeply about, that he really made sure we were taken care of. It was a pure pleasure all those 51 years. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Now I'd like to welcome up Dr. Danny Walker, who is former Wyoming Assistant State Archaeologist.
Thanks, Jason. Before I get into my comments about the Wyoming Archaeological Society, there's one topic that I just realized has not been touched on by any of the speakers yet this morning to any real extent, and that's George's sense of humor. At times it was deep. You really had to sit and listen to it and pay attention because it wasn't obvious all the time. And one of the classic examples of that sense of humor was in 1978. George wanted to go back out to the Colby site and finish excavating between the bone piles to see what else was in that abandoned creek bottom. We did it in August, in Bighorn Basin. Air temperature out there that afternoon was probably about 110. The ground temperature was 120 or more. We got everything all ready to do the final photographs before casting the bone that we had found. So we took a lunch break. The only shade was under the two trucks. So we were all laying on the ground under the trucks, eating lunch. About 2 hours later, George starts mumbling, and I said, "Wait a minute, George, I just remembered June put a watermelon in the truck this morning." That's one of the few times I ever got chewed out by George for having forgotten to bring the watermelon out earlier. So we sat and ate watermelon for a while. About an hour or so later, George says, "Well, I guess we better start thinking about pictures." So he gets out from under the truck. Pretty soon he comes back down and sits back down and says, "You know, there's cloud developing up over the hill. Wait for it to come because that'll make the light more even and get good light for the photographs." So I looked out. That cloud was about that big, probably centered over Jackson Lake. So we finally did get the photographs, but that's the kind of, you got to be around George a lot to be able to pick up on those kind of little comments that he had. But anyhow, going with the Wyoming Archaeological Society, I've been involved with them a long time, but not near, of course, as George did. But in February of 1953, 6 Sheridan, Wyoming residents met to discuss their common interest in the archaeology of Wyoming. At that time, the only people doing archaeology in the state was Bill Malloy, who was still involved to some extent, but the River Basin Survey was in major work across a lot of the places in Wyoming that they did work, but nobody else was doing any other kind of work. These 6 people were Alice and Fred Hillman, John McClintock, Pauline McIntosh, Margaret Powers, and R.C. Benson. We owe these 6 people a major, massive debt of gratitude for what they did that February. Because in 1954, the Wyoming Archaeological Society was formally incorporated as a nonprofit organization in the state of Wyoming and remains so today. George told me once he would have been at that 1953 meeting, except a blizzard hit the top of the Bighorn Mountains and he couldn't drive through it to get to Sheridan from Tinsley. However, we do know that he was involved with that group long before that meeting. And I found out that he was actually involved the following year to an extent I didn't know about, because I found out record that he was a formal monthly guest speaker to the group. I couldn't find out any evidence of what the topic that he talked about, but that was when he was working Spring Creek Caves, so it might have had something to do with that. But I realized that that talk is historic because it was probably his first public speech about archaeology. In 1959, a second chapter was organized in Casper, with the Cody chapter being organized in 1960. The Archaeological Society was well on its way to being a real statewide organization. Today there are 9 chapters and over 400 members, with nationwide membership and some members from Canada. Since its inception, the WAS has had an immeasurable effect on Wyoming archaeology, and that continues today. In the 1950s, the list of sites excavated by this fledgling group out of primarily Sheridan and Casper is impressive. What's even more impressive is those people wrote up a report on the sites they were excavating and published them in the Plains Anthropologist. They knew right from the start, like George did, that the work's not done until the paperwork's finished, and you make that data available to the rest of the profession and to the general public. Little Bald Mountain, Kaufman Cave, Bighorn Medicine Wheel, 48 JO301, JO303, Turk Burial, Sisters Hill, Leith and Billy Creek Burials, Powers Yonke, Buffalo Creek, Piney Creek. All those sites were excavated by the Sheridan chapter, some with George's help, most of them without George being there because he had ranch obligations to do. These sites are often still discussed together today as archaeologists continue to evaluate the original data as well as new data. For example, the continued work just last summer by OWSA at the Sisters Hill site. Bill Malloy was teaching at UW by this time, but not doing much field work in Wyoming archaeology. Other than the river basin surveys, the WAS was the prime archaeological group in the state of Wyoming. Malloy was often on Easter Island and even out of state. The WAS was so active at this time that the River Basin Survey delegated the society to assign their own site numbers and began anything after the number 300 in our records today we know was delegated by the WAS in those early days. All of George's sites, Wardell, Glenrock, all of them have that early 300 series number. The society also had its own paper archive and repository for their recovered material. When George returned to school in 1962 to begin a planned career in professional archaeology, he had already developed an impressive list of sites he investigated by himself. But during those previous 10 years of his involvement with the WAS, almost the entire crew list for George's dissertation sites were WAS members. The trend continued until the early 1970s when major grant funding allowed the hiring of students, but WAS members continued to volunteer as long as George was leading field projects. Perhaps one of the biggest volunteer projects the WAS ever undertook happened in 1967. Mark talked a little bit about that time when the Office of the State Archaeologist was approved by the Wyoming legislature. The University of Wyoming established the Department of Anthropology with 3 faculty members, including George, plus Bill Malloy. The other 2 faculty members refused the department head, which was probably a smart thing to do, right, Todd? So it fell by default to George. For a couple years before that, WAS had been lobbying the state legislature to create an official state archaeologist. That legislation also passed in the spring of '67 and required the individual to have a PhD in archaeology and be a member of the UW anthropology faculty. The position was funded on a quarter-time basis with a little bit of expense money, and George, being the only eligible archaeologist in the fledgling department because Bill Malloy was not interested and was on a 9-month university appointment, he was the only eligible person and served until 1984. At the time, many other states were also establishing a state archaeologist position, often within an existing state agency, but without any direct academic connection. The original proposed bill mirrored many of those other state statutes, but like Mark also said, the final bill in Wyoming included the PhD and faculty requirements. In the early 1970s, with the advent of CRM archaeology, the society continued their support from Wyoming archaeology and consolidated their records and collections at the university. These WAS collections eventually became the Cultural Records Office and the University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository at the university, both of which continue to be great benefit to both academic and other archaeologists. Throughout the initial growing pains and subsequent coming of age of CRM, George played at first an active and then an advisory and influential role in assuring CRM archaeology and academic archaeology remained in touch. All of this, of course, started with George's relationship to and with the WAS from 1953. Perhaps one of the biggest legacies between George and the WAS was his insistence his students continue the association between themselves and the WAS, or if they left the state, avocational groups in those states. This insistence became apparent in my first semester of grad school in 1973. Well, one morning in late winter, George walks into the grad student office area and hands out titles and abstracts where all the students give talks at the annual WAS meeting that spring. I didn't even know what the WAS was. He did the same thing the following fall for the Plains Conference. This continued for several years until all new grad students were warned by the old grad students to start submitting your abstracts early before George had a chance to write them for you. While my background with the WAS will never be the same as George's, I must say over the years I have learned a lot from society members. Back in the 1990s and early 2000s, I had volunteer WAS crews where some members had more field experience at the time than many of the CRM crews active in Wyoming. I enjoyed telling student workers to not get cocky, but listen to the voice of experience digging next to you. I also told those WAS members they had free rein to slap them up the side of the face if they got cocky. And a couple times I think they did. You never know what's in the background of those volunteers that will help your project. Like who knew about the background of George knowing how to blow holes in rocks to blow them up into small pieces? Specifically, more like the coal miner who removed overburden from a bison kill site where the clay was so hard a pick would not even penetrate. Or the time a volunteer got curious about the sandy clay in a site and wondered if there was gold in it. Got out his gold pan. Didn't find gold, but he found glass trade beads smaller than the 16 mesh window screen we were using for water screening. We would not have known anything about those beads without the curiosity and the knowledge of how to go gold mining. The glass beads fell out because they were lead. They fell out like gold because of their weight. While some professional archaeologists even today continue to downgrade the knowledge of avocationals, George is an example of what can and should be learned from WAS and other avocationals. Their combined knowledge is phenomenal and must be addressed to really understand what is out there. Professional archaeologists cannot be everywhere. The good news is this tradition is highly apparent here at UW, and we all will continue to learn from George's legacy. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Robert Kelly, another longtime colleague of Dr. Frison in the department.
Yesterday, a reporter from the Branding Iron interviewed me, and one of the questions she asked me was, she wanted me to be able to tell her what made George successful, what allowed him to be as successful as he was, especially given that his professional career really didn't start until his early 40s. So as part of my answer, I related this little story about George. It was back in 1982. I was a graduate student. I happened to be here in Laramie at the time, and George was asked by the Bureau of Reclamation to test a cave site up on the North Fork of the Shoshone. And so he took me, and he took Larry Todd and Dave Rapson and Eric Ingbar, whom some of you know, up there to test this site. We didn't expect to find anything at this site because it's way, way, way up this talus slope. You can't really see it driving through the canyon today. So we went up there, and we started to excavate a large test unit just outside the mouth of the cave. And it got deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually, the others were working inside the cave, and I was stuck working with George outside the cave. I say stuck because if you worked with George, you had to work your butt off. You know, there was no stopping. So George was at the bottom of this hole, digging and digging, and the hole was too deep for him to throw the dirt out of the hole. So he threw the dirt up to the level that I was standing on. Then I had to shovel the dirt out, up and out of the hole. And this just kind of went on and on and on, and I'm going, oh my God, when is this going to stop? And at one point, I went down to take a shovel full of dirt, and I saw George, and he was going, shh. And he points to the top of the hole we were in. And there, on the edge of the hole, was this little tiny bird, just sitting there, looking back and forth at us, just sat there for a few minutes, and I'm thinking to myself, just stay there, little birdie. I'm getting arrests from all this. But the bird flew off, and then we went back to throwing the dirt out of this hole. So what I learned from that, and what I learned many other times from George, if you want to be successful in life, first thing you have to do is work your butt off. Put the hours in. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you're not willing to put the hours in, you're not going to be successful. And that's what one of the things that made George successful was he put the hours in. But also, he knew when to stop and just kind of enjoy the beauty of Wyoming's nature around him. That's also important to being successful. I also wanted to read here a letter that was sent to some of us by Vance Haynes. Some of you know Vance Haynes. He's only a few years younger than George. And I think it's fair to say he's the creator, would you say, of the field of geoarchaeology? One of the creators of this field. And he worked for a long time with George on issues of geology and dating at the sites that George was working on. So Vance just wrote a short letter to us here. The passing of George C. Frison is a major loss not only to Wyoming, but to the nation and American archaeology in particular. For me, it is a great personal loss because I usually ask George for his take on various Paleo-Indian sites and new finds and vice versa. To work with him in the field was not only a pleasure, but often a revelation about new knowledge and possible interpretations. His legacy will prevail as his many students and colleagues carry on. In addition to his scientific contributions, and you have to know that Vance Haynes, besides being an excellent geoarchaeologist, is also, I don't think it would be incorrect to say he's an expert in firearms, especially old firearms. In addition to his scientific contributions, he is a World War II U.S. Navy veteran, contributed to victory in the Pacific. His return with a Japanese 6.5 millimeter Arisaka rifle provided him and his ranch family with a means of sustenance by hunting in his early post-war years. And the story I've heard is that after George was discharged from the Navy in San Francisco, he hitchhiked from San Francisco to Cheyenne, and then took a bus from Cheyenne up to Ten Sleep, all the while carrying a duffel bag full of Japanese weapons. Try doing that today. His devoted wife, June, will always be remembered for her contributions to George's success, and if June were here today, she would say, "That's right, you know." And to field camp life, particularly her fabulous meals. George and June are survived by a wonderful daughter, Carol, to whom my daughter, Lisa, and I extend our deepest sympathy regarding her loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to, I'd really like to welcome up here Tom Westball at this point, a member of the Friends, the Board of Friends of the Frison Institute.
It's an honor to be here today. My granddaughter, who's 12 years older, my mother and father are both doctors, and she got the flyer for this thing, and she looked at it, and she called me and said, "Hey, Grandpa, are they going to give you an honorary doctorate? I mean, everybody else here is a doctor. You're just an arrowhead hunter." And she's more or less right. I've been on the Frison board for about 10 years, and our goal is to raise funds for ongoing archaeological opportunity. But I also have a couple reminiscences about George that I want to share with you. My son and brother had just found a cache of artifacts along Box Elder Creek in eastern Colorado. And they'd taken it to the Stone Age Fair, and this is where I'd first met George many, many years ago at the Stone Age Fair. George would always show up, and you all know that when George went out in public, he didn't dress up. He dressed down. He had his overalls on, and oftentimes a work shirt and his old cap. And I look across the room, and here's my brother talking to George Frison, but he doesn't know who George Frison is. And I hear George say, "So, son, what you got here?" And my brother says, in a loud voice, because I think he thought perhaps maybe George was a little hard-headed, "Well, what we have here is what we call a cache." And I levitated across the room as fast as I could. And I grabbed Doc's hand and I said, "Doc, it's so good to see you." And my brother's face turned 17 shades of red. And George, someone earlier mentioned his beautiful sense of humor. He winked at me and he said, "Oh, he was doing a pretty good job of explaining it." And I think that's part of the legacy of George, is that gentle humor, that kindness. I had the opportunity to work with him at the Powers site for a number of years. We would be out screening red ochre, and I would find an artifact. He would look at it and say, "Yep, that's something, all right." I was never fortunate enough to find one of the Clovis points they found there. It was more or less waste flakes that I was finding. But it was all right, because every time I would find something, I would show it to him, and every time I would show it to him, he'd say, "Yeah, that's something, keep going." The only other story that I want to tell about George, and I don't know if this story is true, but George and I were sitting around one evening and having a few libations, and I got to talking about Dennis Stanford, because Dennis actually grew up in Sterling, where I'm from, and everybody in Sterling back in the old days knew him as Denny, and they still talk, "Yeah, that guy Denny, that was that archaeologist, did he ever turn out to be anything?" Well, George told me the story that the first time he met Dennis Stanford was at a field school. Dennis had been sent up there by his parents because Dennis was kind of rowdy. And yeah, for those of you that have been in camp with Dennis, you know that to be true. And Dennis had worked a couple of days with him. And George said, "I went out one night to the pickup to get some supplies, and here was Dennis Stanford stealing the battery from my truck." And he said, again, "I'm not sure that's," he said, "but here's the thing is, and he told me, he said, this is part of my legacy about Dennis Stanford. I made him work all summer and turned him into an archaeologist." And we all know the wonderful legacy that Dennis Stanford brought to North American archaeology. It was really rather remarkable. When I think about legacy, I think about the lengthened shadow of an individual. And the Frison Institute and the endowment funds that are raised are the lengthened shadow of an individual. They give us an opportunity to take Doc's work and move it forward, to take Doc's work and to continue that for the years to come. And the money that we raise is an opportunity for graduate students and undergraduate students and professors to do archaeological research. George loved writing, as we all know, because he wrote so many papers, but he really loved dirt. He really loved the opportunity to be in the field, to experience what that was like. I had an opportunity one day talking with him at Powers. He said, "I've been doing this dirt work for a long time." And he said, "There's just something about this stuff that just gets in your blood." He was 92 at the time. And, you know, I looked at him when we were screening, and he just has this big enigmatic grin on his face. For those of us in the collector community, you know, we knew that George didn't say a lot, but any time he said anything, it was the E.F. Hutton approach. You listened, because he was going to drop a gem on you, and it was going to be something that you were going to learn from. I think his legacy was that he was collector-friendly. I mean, you know, he showed me the first arrowhead he ever found when he was a kid. And he said, I understand what you guys are about. He said, and I get that. He said, I'd like to move you forward towards professionalism and like to move you forward towards making sure you're responsible collectors, but I get what you're into, and I share that with you. And I think his legacy of kindness towards us really promoted a sense of professionalism even among those of us who are not professionals. You know, encouraged us to record our finds, encouraged us to make sure that we reported important finds to the state archaeologist or to other archaeologists that were amenable to working with the collector community. So, my dad was a Presbyterian minister. And you know, we've had 6 people here today. The preaching's now done. And you know what happens when the preaching's done? That's when we pass the hat. Well, I'm not going to pass the hat, but what I am going to do to encourage you to contribute to the Frison Memorial Fund. There's many, many opportunities to do this, and I would challenge you to do this because every bit of this money is going to go for future archaeological research, for future archaeological opportunities. My dad used to say, give till it hurts. Well, I want to have you give till it helps. And I will tell you that the dollars that you will give to the Frison Memorial will help future archaeology in the state of Wyoming and in the West. You know, his legacy should be something that we can all look and go, yeah, you know, Doc Frison, Doc Frison, Doc Frison. I look out and the people here that I know, and there are very few lives that have not been touched directly or indirectly by Dr. Frison and the things that he did. You know, the teaching that he did, the camaraderie that he shared, all really important things. So I want to mention to you how you can give. First off, there's a box outside that is a donation box, and we'd love to have you drop a couple hundred in there on your way out today. I know those are the grad students who were laughing. I understand that. Greatly appreciated. Another way to give is in your flyer today, you have an opportunity to mail us something, or we're now high-tech, you can go online and you can make a donation online. One of the fascinating things was that the money managers for the University of Wyoming dropped their rate from 10% to 1.5%. So now when you donate online, all of that money is going to go directly into the Memorial Fund. And with that endowment, we're going to be able to increase the number of grants that we give to professional archaeologists. We will probably use some of that money to enhance opportunities, stipends and things for people coming in. You know, University of Wyoming has this amazing reputation, because of Doc Frison, frankly, with its archaeology department. And looking at all the people here today that have spoken, there's a rich legacy here. You know, it can go away. You know, the world really doesn't care that much about archaeology, but we all do. So let's put our money where our values are. And let's make sure that Doc Frison's legacy is the extended shadow of an individual. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you today. It's been great being here.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of you for being here today to celebrate Doc Frison. We now have a reception scheduled so we can continue to share memories and share stories as a group. So thank you for coming.